There we are. All right, hello everyone. Welcome to Writing for Accessibility, presented by the IT Accessibility Initiative of the Department of Disabilities Assistive Technology Program. Thank you all for joining us today. Usual housekeeping items. We do have captioning available today. You can turn that on from the button on your menu ribbon. This webinar is being recorded, and the slide deck was shared ahead of time about 15 minutes ago. So please check your email. If you did not receive it for whatever reason, please do not worry. We'll be sending out the slide deck again when I send out the recording, probably on Friday. If you don't receive it then, please reach out to us. I'll put our contact information at the end and list it out so that you can reach out to us for whatever reason. With that, today's learning objectives are, first, we're going to explain what is alternative text and its usage in different scenarios. That'll be the bulk of our presentation today. Second, we'll talk about how to describe complex images, so things like infographics and charts and graphs, and when an alternative method may be needed and what some of those might look like. And then finally, we'll spend just a few minutes on how to cover proper link description and distinction so that we're making sure that we're telling people where they're going or what's going to happen when they click something, because feedback is very important. So, alternative text. You've likely heard the term before because it is pretty much rule one of the guidelines of any accessibility presentation you come across. Whenever you hear accessibility, you think about how do I communicate visual content to a non-visual person. So alternative text is a text-based description that's used in place of an image or other non-text content. So when assistive technology like a screen reader finds that image, it reads this alt text to the user so that they get the same information or equivalent experience that a sighted person gets. Now, it's not limited to screen readers. Other assistive technologies make use of it. Magnifiers that have a voiceover option will read it too. Occasionally, other types of assistive technology will use it either to add additional information to it, or in some cases, when it's if people are using like individualized style sheets, it might strip out images and will serve in place. So that's a little lesser known part of alt text, is that it will display when an image is unable to, either due to a broken link, some other form of CSS, or an issue stripped out images, or if the user at the other end has either slow internet or has an outage, that alt text will display instead of the image. So it's a way to still get that information out there. So multiple uses. Example on screen here is pulled from the Wikipedia alternate text example. And it is an image that is actual text. And then below it is the inspect window from a browser. In there, you see the code for HTML. It's the image, its source, which is example.jpg, and then the alt tag or alt attribute, sorry, that has the content example text, because the picture is reading and it or shows text saying example text. Now, I do want to mention today, we're not going to cover HTML at all. We're not going to talk about coding. All these kinds of things can be done usually with in the properties menu of an image in like Google and Gmail or Google Docs or in Word or Excel. If you're working with a content management system like WordPress or Squarespace, there'll be a descriptions form field or something similar to that. So there's almost always a way. Social media platforms have it too. There's almost always a way to add this. What we're going to be talking about today really is what to put in there. So if for whatever reason you want to know more about the HTML or whatever, please refer to our previous webinars or reach out to me. Be happy to talk at length about that. So when we're writing alt text, there's a few guidelines to follow. I've broken it into two sections. One is the general rules that apply to pretty much any instance of alternative text. And the second one is situational rules. So in different ways you might use alt text depending on the kind of image you're putting or what is the purpose of that. So we'll start with the general rules. First off, remain concise and direct. You really don't want to go over more than a sentence. The more you write in there, the more description you add, the longer the user has to sit there and listen to it. In some cases, that might be useful, But in other cases, that's going to take a lot of time. They might not bother listening to the whole thing, and they can't like leave it and come back and start back in where they left off. They have to restart from the beginning. So if you try to fit a whole flyer's worth of information in the alt text, they're going to have to listen to that maybe 2 or 3 times just to pull out maybe the event's time or its location or something like that in order to copy it. And they can't just take that text and copy it out. So you really want to keep it short and sweet. If you start thinking yourself, this is too long and too wordy, it likely is. The second thing is to avoid interpretation. You really are just stating the focus of the image, what's in it. Any extraneous detail like background parts or the weather status or something like that might not be helpful. And also you want to avoid adding adjectives like, is this good or this is bad, unless it's absolutely relevant to the conversation. Kind of over the top example is maybe a picture of ineffective use of a hammer. That doesn't really tell us anything. That doesn't tell us the action that's happening. So we want to instead make the alt text of that hammer hitting thumb instead of nail, or missing nail and hitting thumb. That really, that is an image we can either put in our imagination, or that a user is really going to understand what is the action being performed here versus, oh, that was bad. Yes, but we need to actually, have that reinforcement of it. Now, this can change on context. So context of the conversation, of the other parts of your post, what text you're putting in there, all of that is going to impact what you write here. And really, you are putting in the purpose of the image. Why did you put it here? What is it adding to your post? If it's adding extra details like who else was attending an event, or if it's details about who the person is, that kind of thing, that's a great use for it. This will be a bit easier to explain in the example slide on the next part, so I'll go more into more detail then. But for right now, just think about, what are you adding? Is this additional information that needs to be conveyed? Is it reinforcing a point? Things like that. One addition to this that came up from question for previous webinars is things like proper names, pronouns, ethnicities, other details like that. That really depends on the subject matter. Proper names can be useful if you're specifically, it's to show that person. So in something like Governor Westmore at a ceremony, then you would want to use the proper name there in the alt text, because we need to communicate, yes, this is indeed this person. If in the case of something like a board of directors at a conference or something like that, then no, we don't want to use proper names, because that would add several people's names and they might not all be a part of this, or rather they're part of this as a group. And so we're more focused on the group. So think about your subject of your photo and how that needs to be communicated. Things like pronouns and ethnicities, in general, it's safer, I guess, would be the best way to put it, of you really only enter it if it's a needed detail. In most cases, especially if you don't know, like you were given this content by another person and you're making a guess, it's probably easier just to remove it. And in most cases, it's not as it's not as much of a concern, because really, again, we're talking about actions or uh, events, that kind of thing, but it may be necessary. So keep in mind that it's really going to depend on what is the rest of your post or your paragraph or your report, what have you. And then fourth point, don't use picture of or image of. The reason for that is because the assistive technology already does that for you. Screen readers, voice control software, magnifiers will all tell the user what type of element this is. So it'll tell them this is an image, or this is a button, or this is a link. In case of an image that's working as a link, it'll say graphic link, all that kind of thing. So all you're really doing is creating redundancy. So it's just save yourself the trouble and the couple extra keystrokes. There is a caveat to that, though. If you're showing a particular type of picture or photo, like a panorama or a headshot, in those cases, you would state that. So, panorama of the Inner Harbor or headshot of Governor Westmore, because that tells us it's a specific type of image and we know the format that that's going to be. Panorama is a very wide, uh, short type of photo. A headshot is, like in the case of the Zoom window here, my shoulder is up. Those kinds of particular types of photos, because that's additional detail that's useful to us. Now, some situational rules. This is when you have particular types of images. So in the case of the example on the previous slide from the Wikipedia article, a text image, where you have text in the image that is relevant and needs to be communicated to the user. That needs to be put in the description. So in most cases, if you're doing like a flyer or something, you want to put those details in the alternative text, or if it's too much, direct them to where they can get it. Ideally, we would not use images to show text. We want to use what's called real text. So text that's actually in the code, that's manipulative by the browser or by other means, because that allows users to use things like increased font size or magnification or change color, so that those who are colorblind or have low vision are able to change it to to fit with their needs, or in some cases be able to highlight and cut and paste it if they want like the address to an event or something, that kind of thing. So ideally we would not do this. However, it does sometimes occur. So we need to make sure that, again, that information is not lost when a user is finding this image and needs to hear a description instead. Now, image links. In those cases, kind of the same idea, except we want to state the link destination in the description. We don't really go into any detail about the image itself. Instead, we're going to tell them what happens when you click this link. Where will it take me? Will it take me to the Department of Disabilities website? Will it take me to the IT Accessibility Initiatives website inside there? That kind of thing. We'll show that more later on. Now, decorative images. Those should use an empty alt attribute or be marked as such. A lot of management systems or programs like Word or PowerPoint here have a checkbox that says mark as decorative. And what happens when you click that is that it adds that empty attribute. The attribute's still there, excuse me, but it doesn't have content. So assistive technology knows, okay, I can skip this image. It's not adding anything. We'll talk more about when to use this later on. And then finally, logos. You want to state these as such. Whose logo is it? You don't want to go into details about the logo, and you don't have to. That's actually an exemption listed in the guidelines. The reason for that is because it is more important that the user understand this is this person's content. They've branded it. It's official, that kind of thing. Or, this is part of theirs. The only time you really go into the description of a logo is on your web page where you're describing your branding or the rules of your company's branding to your employees, that kind of thing. In general, it's more important that we know whose logo it is rather than what it looks like, especially because they tend to be complicated. So for example, our logo at the start of this presentation, its alt text is Maryland Department of Disabilities Assistive Technology Program logo. I couldn't fit that all on the slides, that's why it doesn't say that, but it's the same idea. So I wrote it out because it's the first instance. Acronyms, generally you follow the same writing principles where the first instance, you write it out, and then from then on, you can use the acronym. The only place I would say you can maybe get away with not doing that is on a website where when we're actually using either the search engine or the URL to get to it, you might have it written out elsewhere, like on the first headline of your web page or your home page. In those cases, it's kind of expected that we know who you are and we can use the acronym. But we don't want to describe the logo in that detail. So I didn't want to describe it as Maryland flag with text changing Maryland for the better. It doesn't tell you whose it is, it just tells you that what it looks like. So that's one of the final kind of exemptions. Now, these aren't hard and fast rules. They can change based on situation or on your needs. In some cases, yes, you kind of have to go over a sentence in order to describe an image, especially if it's a rather bit large image, and you're talking about something that's maybe not as widely known. And in those cases, you might have to go into a bit more detail. Um, Again, I'm really just trying to give you the basic starter guidelines, and then you can kind of finagle to fit your situation. Um, my best advice I can give you guys is if you're not sure, go into extra detail or make sure you add something. Because at the very least, it's easier for a user to either skip it because they don't want to listen to the entire thing or have it at least available. Because if you don't add it, or if you mark it as decorative when it does add something, then there's no way for them to get that information. Or they might have to rely on other tools that might try and like auto generate descriptions, AI, all that kind of thing. And that might not give them the same message you intended. So just take an extra minute or two, write out the alt text. If you're working with someone else's content, reach out to them, ask them for the alt text because they're going to know what was the purpose of that image and you don't have to make that guess. So if you're the content manager for a website and someone else handed it to you, include them in the work because it's going to make it easier for you. All right, let's work through an example today. So I pulled this image from X's Help Center article on how to add alt text. I really like this image because I can do quite a bit with it in terms of this. So I have four kind of scenarios of when I would change this. So the first is a standard description, the general posting. So the image on screen is they're adding alt text to an image of a coffee cup while they're making a post. The description they wrote in is a small white mug with a tiny loop handle with a shot of deep brown espresso and a light brown crema on top. The mug sits on a small white saucer on a medium brown wooden table. This is 178 characters out of 1,000. Never go up to 1,000. I'm going to question you. Why would you do that? That's a lot. That's, at least a page worth. But the big thing with this is that screen readers and a lot of other AT is they're going to have a character limit of how much they read in a single go. And while that can be changed per personal preference, in general, it's going to be shorter than a sentence. I would consider this too wordy. However, if you posted with this, at most, I'm just going to make a suggestion of like, it could be shorter, it could be, more concise, but it's still a good description. So as a standard description for just a general post about something, perfectly acceptable. Now, let's talk about how that can change based on context. Who is posting this and why? So the first example is a coffee shop. If I, as a manager of a coffee shop, am posting this and trying to attract customers, I'm probably going to be talking about what's actually in the cup. What is the espresso? Where is it made from? What kind of beans? How is it roasted? That kind of deal. So my description for this instead would be a small white mug with a shot of deep brown espresso and a light brown crema on top. Stop there because I am talking just about the coffee. That's my product. That's what I'm trying to draw your attention to. That is the focus of this image. The mug, the saucer, those are just delivery mechanisms. They're just extraneous details. The table, especially because you barely see any of the table in this image. You see like maybe a square foot at best of it. You don't see any legs, you don't see the edges, you don't see any of that details. So ultimately, it's just the assumption that it's a table and it's an extra detail that really isn't adding anything to our conversation. So I'm instead going to tell you more detail about my focus, which is the coffee that I'm trying to sell to you. Now, on the opposite side, a home furnishing store that's trying to sell you the mug and the saucer. For them, my recommendation of a description would be a small white mug on a small white saucer with a tiny loop handle with a shot of espresso. I'm keeping all the details about the product that is the focus point of what I'm trying to do. In this case, the mug and the saucer, it's set. And then adding just the detail about the espresso to say, this is what it holds. See, isn't it perfect? So that's where the context of who's writing this and what they're trying to do with it is going to change the focus of the image and why they added it there. What are they trying to point out to you? What details are immediately important? Now, on the third end, the personal account, where I'm not, concerned about trying to sell you a product to tell you more details about the product. I'm just talking about maybe my day out. I'm at the coffee shop having a good old time. In that case, I might do something very simple, like, small mug of espresso. Or maybe I'll talk, maybe I really like the espresso and I'm talking about that. And I might say, deep brown espresso with light brown crema. Um, I might go into more detail based on that, but it's going to be very short and sweet because probably the majority of my post is talking about how I'm having a good old time at the coffee shop. Stop by. So that's where I'm really keeping it more short and sweet. I'm not adding a lot of extra detail, and I'm really just kind of keeping it there or adding the image to show off what I'm doing. And that's perfectly acceptable too. Um, in some cases, people are going to rely here on the auto-generated descriptions. And I do want to warn people against using those for right now because they are they tend to be very simple, sometimes too simple, and sometimes they don't get them right. In the case of this image, when I added it, it said a screenshot of a computer, which is technically true because it has edit photo and a save button and a form field, and the format was pulled from a screenshot, but that wasn't the purpose of the image or what it adds or anything it contains. And so it's extremely generic. And so that's why it's almost always better to add your own alt text, even if it's very simple and very short and sweet, like small mug of espresso. That still gives us the focus point of that image, whereas the auto-generated one is going to guess, or it might go into far too much detail if you're using a more advanced one. Now, link description. So this image instead is functioning as a link to maybe go buy a bag of that coffee or buy a set of those mugs. And in those cases, this description is going to change to who the seller is and where that product, what product is it. So, small white mug set dash Walmart, Target, wherever. Um, that would be the description. Or in case of the coffee, uh, uh, dark espresso slash Folgers or something. Essentially, we're telling people this is the product, where they're going to get it, and where they're going. Or if this was like my personal account, I said, hey, check out this coffee shop I went to. I would probably just say, here's the name of the coffee shop. Maybe I'd say, homepage or website in the description too. Not necessary, but it's there. So that's kind of where instead our description is just telling people this is where you're going if you click this. Because ideally, people need to be wary of just any link they click. So the more we can tell them about what's going to happen, the better. And finally, decorative. The best way to think about this is, again, that personal account where I'm really just talking about my day, and I might just include this photo to fill space, or maybe just kind of show what I'm doing. I'm at the coffee shop drinking coffee, because that's what you do at a coffee shop. In those cases, maybe it's best to mark it as decorative because I'm not really giving you any additional information. I'm talking about something else entirely. I just included a photo of whatever's in front of me. So in those cases, having a decorative image, perfectly fine. But if it's not adding anything, why should I clutter up the interface for a user? All right, so I would like to try something a bit different than I normally do here today. So I'm going to launch a poll about the image on screen. So this is an example. Uh, I have 4 options for what would be a good description of the picture of a dog. If anyone attending today is non-visual, is blind or low vision, or is just not looking at the screen at this time, it is a picture of a gold dog is standing in a field. That should be a major kind of hint. I'm just going to give it just a minute or so. Give another 15 seconds. I should mention as we're going along, you can feel free to post questions in chat or Q&A. I will try to answer them as we go, but more than likely I'm going to save them to the end, just because I'm looking at 2 screens and I can't always see it. All right, so I'm going to end the poll now, and it looks like about 80% of our respondees today said English Cocker Spaniel standing in a field. And yes, that is what I would consider a good description. So very simple, short and sweet. Tell us exactly what is in here. Now, the wordy description is the second option. So this image shows an English Cocker Spaniel with long golden fur and long ears standing in a field of green grass. It is a sunny day. So first off, best practice says don't use this image. So we would want to remove that. And then it adds extra details that aren't really necessary. Is it a sunny day? I mean, it might be helpful if we're talking about like, oh, check out my cute dog as she wanders around in the field. Yeah, maybe we want to add it then. But in most cases, I would consider that not useful information. And now for the long golden fur and long ears, those are defining characteristics of this breed. So by using the proper name for it, English Cocker Spaniel, I'm kind of already making an assumption that those are there. Now, if a person didn't know this, or in the case of the fact that this image came from the American Kennel Club article on this breed, then maybe it would be useful information. But this is one that I would consider could use tweaking. Doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. And if you did this, I'd probably just make suggestions of how to improve it. But it's a decent description. It just could be better. Now, a bad description is the third option, which I'm glad to see no one picked. And that is just a file name, spaniel underscore 01252015.jpg. In most cases like this, a lot of the times that sometimes these programs will default to that, and that's really not helpful at all, because occasionally, yes, if you named your file properly or added a more descriptive name to the file, we can glean some information from it, but not everything. And in other cases, there's nothing to get here because it's just a string of text of numbers and letters. I can assume that's a date based on how most cameras will save a photo based on the date or add the date to it. But that's not always necessarily true. And it is guesswork on my part as a consumer. And that's what we're trying to remove. So this does nothing to describe the image or help us. In some cases, might hurt us. And then finally, that fourth option was a bit of a curveball that, if I made this image a link, we would want to use this instead. So it kind of was a right answer, but not. But I wanted to include it because it's important to point out. So since if I had made the image a link to this article, I'd want to put that in the description. So the American Kennel Club English Cocker Spaniel, so that the user understands they're going to the article on this breed at this organization's website, because that's where I pulled it from. So that's where a good description for an image link would come into play. I hope that was clear to everyone. So now, decorative images, when to use these, or rather, sorry, how should we work with these and describe them? So decorative images are intended to visually define an area. Usually these are things like divider bars or direction arrows or anything that kind of divides the space up into blocks that help us visually organize content. One caveat to directional area, air, arrows, I can't speak today, I'm sorry, is step transitions. If you're doing something like a flow chart or something, in some cases, it still might be useful to add description there and say step 1 to step 2, especially if your flow chart is broken up into like several parts, in which case you might want to give people a way to identify which way they're going. But most decorative images don't add contextual value. And this is where you need to make a judgment call of what is this doing, and do you think a user gains anything from this? As I said before, if you're not sure, err on the side of providing some form of description, if only because then a user can make the choice to skip it on their own versus not getting information that potentially they may have needed. But ultimately, think about if you're just adding the image just to fill space, or in some cases creating, an aesthetic to help draw attention to something. In those cases, it's probably going to be decorative, and you can safely skip it. The third time you want to consider images as decorative is when you're repeating them. So things like logos on multiple decks of or multiple slides of your deck, or images in your header or footer as they repeat on pages. Times like that is when you want to. Sorry, I just saw the. Okay. Quick question was, will this presentation be shared? I have to log off for another meeting. Yes, it will be. It is being recorded. It will be posted probably on Friday and the slide deck shared out. Thank you. So yes, repeated images are things where the first instance, we'd probably label it, but then from then on, we want to mark it as decorative, mostly just to save clutter and make it a more user-friendly experience. So a couple examples here on the screen. First is a heading, topic, alt text that has a divider bar underneath it, and then a paragraph explaining that. The above bar is dividing between a heading and content. Visually, this defines the relationship. AT users receive the same context from the stylization and do not need the image. So for a visual learner, or not learner, but for a sighted person, that heading, topic of alt text, in this case, I didn't bold it, but since it's separated like that, and then there's that line, I understand that this is the heading for this block of text, and it's going to talk about that topic. For a screen reader user, when they find that, the screen reader will tell them, if we did it properly, topic, alt text, heading 2 or heading 1, whatever level of heading you chose. And then they can move to the paragraph and start reading the paragraph because they will know the next content should be related to that topic. If we did topic, alt text, heading, and then had the image there and maybe said divider bar or blue bar, and then paragraph, they'll assume the same thing, but it's an extra input that they have to work through that doesn't add any value because the stylization and the code, if we use the presets correctly, will tell them that information anyway. So we can kind of skip that step. It just makes it a better experience for them. Now, for stock images, the second example. So this is a generic stock image I pulled that is a bunch of thumbs up in the air. It's just to fill space. It doesn't actually add value to the context of my presentation. In this case, it does because I'm talking about it. But if I was just talking about, business practices or something, I just put this in so that you didn't just have a wall of text here. It's not adding anything. It's not relevant to what I'm talking about. It's not showing the actions I'm talking about. So we can mark it as decorative. So in those cases, when you're just adding it to make it look nice or to draw people's attention to it from other things or just to break up walls of text, those cases you can probably mark it as decorative. I see a question in chat that's relevant. Would an image on social media that is being posted as an addition to a caption be considered a decorative image? Uh, if you would probably give it the same description as the caption, and then yes, You could mark it as decorative. Uh, One caveat I would have to that though is in some cases the caption isn't associated with the image. So as in when a user reaches that image with the screen reader, it doesn't read the caption in place of it. You can set it up to do that on a website, but on social media you can't, to my knowledge. So in those cases, um, you might need to still add the description or at least maybe give a bit more detail. So that's again somewhere you would want to make a judgment call. If it's adding additional information or it's showing additional stuff, you might want to go in a bit more detail. And if you can, great. But if you're not going to, then probably mark it as decorative because you're just going to repeat information. I hope that makes sense. Now, the third example I have here is the repeated images. So it's our logo again. So the empty tap logo to the right is repeated from the first slide. Nothing has changed. Users don't need to read this. And if I put it on every single slide, that's one more element they have to read on every slide as they move through my content. And that's going to get repetitive and annoying. And it's not a big deal, but it's like, all right, I have to, oh, it's this again, move on. And I could just save them that step by marking it as decorative. Now, on the final slide, I might repeat it again and add the alt text there and make them read it again because A, I'm reinforcing this was ours, and then B, our contact information. So kind of associating our information there again with us. So just reinforcing that. So that's where maybe a caveat to it of like at the start and end, I might, have the alt text and make it readable, but everywhere in the middle, just remove it in order to maintain the flow of the presentation. Now, infographics. This is where things get challenging because typically these or things like flyers for an event or anything like that have a lot of information on them, more so than we can put in the alt text, either because of programmatic limitations or because of attention spans, or simply because it's a lot of detail. And trying to read that in a single go is not very user friendly. So here's kind of my general guidelines for how to handle these. First off is put the title into the alt text. Tell them what this is. So our example on screen here today is the printout from CDC's Disability Impacts Maryland. The link in there at the bottom will take you to this website with all this information. They'll say, download as PDF. That's where I got this from. So title tells you what it is. Second is in the text around it, you want to summarize this information. So either right before this image or right after it, I'd want to summarize the important points. Maybe I'll pull out the 1,055,353 adults in Maryland have a disability. I might pull that out and say this is here's one of the key statistics you can take away from it. Maybe I'll summarize the different types of disability that are represented here, or maybe some of the disparities or challenges or the healthcare costs. Those kind of details I might pull out. And then I'm going to inform users where they can view all of this data in an accessible manner. So either we can make the image a link. So the image itself will tell users this is the CDC's Disability Impacts Maryland, goes to their website, or I state where the link is. So in the case of this example, if you look at the alt text in PowerPoint from the slide deck I sent you, it should say CDC's Disability Impacts Maryland, visit below for data. So a user knows they should go to the immediate next element, and that'll be source CDC Disability and Health website link. They can click that, then it can get to this information and should be in a readable format for them. And finally, we need to make sure that the alternative is accessible. So if we're sending them to a web page, we're using real text and not just the image again. We might pull out the text and have just a separate write-up that maybe is text only. We might have, in some cases, a separate PDF that has the text as readable tags, which will be a challenge to make. I've talked about it in other webinars on creating accessible PDFs. So if you have questions about that, you can refer to those on how to do that. It can be done. It can be tricky. Going into detail about that, let's talk about charts and graphs because this is kind of a good way to explain that. These have a very similar challenge and approach to infographics, where it's a lot of information presented in a primarily visual manner, or it's separated into an image that they can't read, or it's just too much information to put in the alt text. So we need to direct them to other sources and how to get this information. So title, again, in the alt text, tell them what this is. Summarize the important points in the surrounding text. So have that summary before, after, and then offer the location of the alternative. Make sure they know where to go. As I was talking about in the PDF, you can set up a manual reading order to cluster this data together. It's not ideal because it's going to force users to go through the entire flow of the document. They might have to backtrack or have to make notes somewhere of what information is on what part. And they're going to have to do some mental juggling in order to keep this information together and make it coherent and keep the relations that we're trying to show them. So it's not ideal, so we can make it readable, but we can't really truly make these accessible. There is work being done towards that. I've seen presentations on software that uses things like a piano octave, so musical notes, in order to show kind of comparisons. So like a low octave for the lower data points versus a high octave for data points going up, to kind of try and show that comparison. I've seen presentations, other software that kind of pulls out that information and reads like a whole group together and then reads along the axes titles. But all of that is still kind of either proprietary or it's still experimental. So we haven't truly come up with a fully accessible manner for these. So that's why we need to have an alternative method set up as a secondary way for users to get to this information. Usually for data, that's going to be a table. They're generally easier to make accessible. They can still be a challenge, and they can still not always perform as needed, but they're going to generally be better than a chart or a graph. One key thing of this, though, is that a really large amount of data, you're probably going to need additional features such as sorting and filtering. And in those cases, you really just want to use a web page or an Excel sheet, something that has the tools to set up those kinds of options for users so they can get through it easily. Anything other than that, you're not going to want to use Word or Illustrator or InDesign or any of those other programs, because it's not going to give the users the capabilities they need to properly process that information. So example on screen here of, it's just a generic chart created from Word, and it's the default that shows up when you click make a chart. And chart title you can fill in. And then you have axes titles for the y-axis, and then x-axis. If we were tagging this in the PDF, this would probably be the initial order. So we go chart title, y-axis, y-axis measurements, x-axis title, x-axis measurements, and then probably go through the first category's data points, and the next one, third one, yada yada. So we can kind of cluster that data into a reading order that kind of makes sense, and a user could probably derive what they need from it, but it is going to be a bit of a challenge. So we're going to also offer the alternative, a table. This table has the same 3 series of data points. It's 4 categories with its data points. And if we've created this table correctly, those headings, so category 1, 2, 3, and 4, and series 1, 2, and 3, will properly relay their relationship to the cells, so that when a user is looking at series 3, category 3 with a screen reader, they'll hear 3, column 3, category 3, row 3, series 3. They'll still hear the data relationships to at least the headings. And so they don't have to backtrack to figure out, are they in the right column or are they in the right row, whatever. Now, in order to show those comparisons, they're still going to have to move from cell to cell. So we can't give them a really easy way to make comparisons without having to do the extra work on their end. But it's going to be easier to navigate this table than it is going to be to navigate that chart. Now, tables, I'm not going to go into more detail about how to make an accessible table. I cover this in other webinars. There are plenty of guides on this elsewhere, but in general, you want to follow the best practices for headings and data entry, maintaining those relationships, making sure they're communicated to users. But for additional details about tables, first thing is, like the infographics and charts, you want to summarize the important points in preceding or succeeding text. So this table, I just pulled the same data from the table on the previous slide, 4 categories with their data points. The summary I wrote for this is the table above displays data regarding changes in the following categories: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Categories 1, 2, and 3 are currently falling, while category 4 has seen a surge. So think about like how would you verbalize this information in a presentation? What am I really trying to get the user to take away from this? In this case, it's the trend, that comparison. 3 categories are going down while the 4th category is going up. So make sure to communicate that kind of information to users. You don't want to read out every single data point to them. You don't want to read out every single detail. They just need to make sure that they understand, or we need to make sure that they understand, here's your main categories, what are we comparing, and how do they compare? Now, the alt text for a table should really just be the table's title, because if it's set up properly, it's not just an image of a table, the table should be readable by AT. They should be able to move by cell. It should read data relationships of the column and row headers. So in our case, we just need to make sure that they still understand which table are they looking at. So in most cases, that's going to be done in the alt text. You might have a heading before this that also tells us, or maybe just a bold paragraph line or something. But that's not typically associated with the table programmatically. So screen reader isn't going to read that line of text and then tell them they're in the table. It's just going to read the table as a separate entity. So this way, they still have that table heading. They have to go back to make sure that they're in the right table. It's just there for them. Again, just making it more user-friendly. And then one other point you can usually do, especially in Excel or with a web page, is you can add additional instructions or helpful tips or even comments as comments. So you can tell users, if you have a form built in Excel or something, and they need to move to a different part that's several rows away or something, it's not the immediate next cell, you can add a comment that tells them, please move to cell D17 for the next step. Things like that, or like, if this is a really important point, like your budget or something, and you want to add a comment saying this number is $3,000 more than the point from 4/17/2021 in column or in cell C17. So that way the user understands what is the comparison, what is the important point that we need, but I don't have to go searching for it. It's just told to me immediately. Again, saving those inputs, making it more user-friendly, making it more accessible. All right, so our final point of today is link descriptions. Kind of same general guidelines, but good link text informs users what will happen when they click a link. As we've mentioned with like the image descriptions, we need to tell them where they're going and what is this going to be about. The reason for this is because assistive technology is able to filter through links. Typically, things like screen readers or voice control software or magnification software like ZoomText is able to pull out a list of links on a web page, and a user can just quickly search through them to find something specific. Very useful for people who are visiting a website again and are just like, I just need the IT accessibility issues webpage. So I just need to find that link. Pull up a list of links, read through them, or even just jump to like letter I and start there and find it a lot faster than having to move through the content of the web page. So good link text makes that easy. And that's why I want to do things like avoid repetitive or unhelpful phrases. Repeated instances of click here or learn more. If they just read like that, the user has to go to the link and then has to backtrack or move forward in order to make sure that in context, this is the link they're looking for. So it makes things just a little bit more cumbersome to do. In general, they're also just unhelpful. And we want to make sure that we're also using a phrase, both for clarity to make sure that people understand what they're looking at or looking for, and then also for touch targeting. So you want to avoid using a single word. So a bad example is click this link to learn more about accessibility, with the word link being the only link text. So if I was on mobile, even as a sighted user with no diagnosed disability, I'm probably still having to zoom in order to get to that link and press it. Kind of annoying. Someone with a physical disability who has to use a different kind of control scheme or use the physical assistant built into their phone, or is using um, voice control software and is having to move by grid in order to target that, they're going to have a harder time because they're going to have to either zoom in more or uh, try and click specifically those letters rather than like a space around that. It makes it a lot harder. And then a user, if they're pulling up just a list of links, all they're going to see or hear is link, link, link. That's not helpful. So in this case, instead, we're going to make the whole sentence the link text. So click this link to learn more about accessibility. That'll show up as that, reads to it, nice and easy to press that link because it spans probably the whole width of your phone. You should also note that this meets the AAA standard of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's really easy to do. So honestly, in most cases, I argue just do this rather than try and make it just work in context, because it really doesn't take us any effort to highlight 3 more words to make that the full link text. In this case, we probably could have shortened that to learn more about accessibility or something like that. But I want to make sure I'm giving people a full phrase that communicates what this link is doing, where is it going to go, and provides an easy way to target it. One option as well to add additional information is using what's called title. So that's an attribute that can get added on to other elements like links or images, and that reads in addition to other elements. So in the case of link text, like click here or learn more, there's a title attribute. It might tell us more additional information about that link. Works mostly for screen readers. It can also, I think it does provide a tooltip as well, so that it appears on hover. But in most cases, I think of it at least in terms of this reads in addition to whatever else is in there. Or in the case of an image, it'll read the alt text, but then it will also read title. Now, it's important that it does not replace those things. It is only in addition to. So if you use title, but you don't use the alt attribute, uh, it's going to still read unlabeled graphic, and it'll just read the title, and then the user's going to be mildly confused of why didn't they use the alt attribute instead. Or in a worst case scenario, if you put in an empty alt attribute and put in the title, the alt attribute is going to be the default behavior, and that's just going to be skipped entirely. So make sure you're never using title in place of, you're using it to add to. So in these cases, it's usually good for adding explanations of additional behavior, like this is going to open in a new window, or this is an external link, something like that. Trying to prep people for behaviors that they might not be expecting. All right, I believe I've covered everything I want to for today. So if you have questions, please feel free to add them into chat or Q&A now. In the slide deck, I have plenty of resources available to you. There are a lot of different guides about this online that go into more detail or might cover scenarios I didn't cover today. W3C has one. They're the people who created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I also put in a separate link to their alt text decision tree that can help you kind of make a decision of, should I add alt text to this image or not? What kind of alt text should I add? Or should I mark it as decorative? So that's a useful place to go to making those judgment calls. Then there's a section 508 writing guide, web aims writing guide, kind of all covering the same thing because these are pretty universal principles, but they'll go into a bit more detail or might give you more examples that work. You can kind of see it in action. Then finally, the American Foundation for the Blind and National Federation of the Blind's alt text guides. These are very useful. recommend you check them out, if only just so you can see kind of the perspective of a blind or low visions person for how alt text benefits them and what they should do. So it kind of gives you the consumer side and their experience with it, and it will help hone your skills with writing these. If you ever have questions or you want to know more, or if you need to uh, ask a question about alt text or what to do, you can contact us at mdod.nva@maryland.gov. That email was the one that sent out the slide deck to you. If for whatever reason you didn't receive it, or on Friday, if you don't get the recording and the slide deck again, you should contact us at that email and we'll get it out to you. You can also visit our website, mdod.maryland.gov, and then you can visit our previous webinars on YouTube. Our username is mdtapvideo. All right, questions? Let's see. I'm glad these are helpful to you. All right, what is the official certification for accessibility or 508 compliance, and how do you become certified? Well, that's not really relevant. I'll still answer it anyway. So there are a couple. There is, for the federal government of the United States, there is the 508 Trusted Tester certification. I hold that. You can just Google that and it will take you to, I believe it's DHS, who created the training program, and you can run through that. It's a free program. It's a fairly significant time commitment, but it is free. And that is the certification for testing according to the federal standards. Outside of that, there is the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, IAAP. They produce a number of certifications: Web Accessibility Specialist, Certified Professional in Accessibility Conformances, CPAC it's called. I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for at this time. CPACC. But that is another one. They have a couple others. They don't have courses. It is an exam that you have to pay for, but it is an internationally recognized one because they will test you against the international guidelines. In the case of the CPAC, it's going to be talking about not just US laws, but laws for other countries as well, because it's kind of more of a general overview and understanding of accessibility across the world. Those are the main ones I know of. I don't know of much else beyond those, but they do exist. Let me pull up Q&A. Sorry, forgot about that window for a second there. Do you need to specify click this link? If you have something like a webinar and you say register for ABC webinar and have the whole line as link, would that be acceptable? No, you do not need to specify click this link. In some cases, again, that's kind of a redundancy. Sorry, people have asked this of me before. Generally, no. As long as you have the subject matter as the link text, that's fine. But if you say register for, or in like the case of my example, click this link to learn more, that's fine. As long as there's kind of some identifier of what is this for. You know, click here for the annual report, perfectly acceptable. So in your case, having the whole line register for ABC webinar as the link text, that's great. That's perfect. All right. Click this link. I thought we were supposed to stay away from the term click this link verbiage. Yeah, generally you don't want to, because it is creating redundancy. And we are trying to not do that. I just did that for purposes of this demonstration. In this case, what is the difference between those two? Oh, that part was cut off. Okay, so the difference there was, let me go back to that slide quick. In the first example, that's the bad example, only the word link is the actual link text. So in this case, a user is only going to hear link, or if they're reading the whole sentence, they'll hear click this link to learn more about accessibility. So in those cases, the word link is all that would show up in that list of links, or that's all they would hear as the link, and it forces them to have to read the surrounding context. It also makes it harder for like clicking the link with your mouse or with on your mobile phone, things like that. And that's where using a whole sentence is better. And that's the difference, is that the second example here, the whole sentence, click this link to learn more about accessibility, is better. Now, as you pointed out, yes, we want to try and avoid using click this link and click this link to learn more. That is adding redundancy. But really what I'm trying to get people to do is use a whole phrase or a whole sentence as linked text. So yeah, ideally this would be learn more about accessibility as the linked text. But we could, in some cases, like if you have like a news page and you have a lot of different, links that say learn more and learn more, and you want to maintain the aesthetic look, you could use title to add those details, like learn more about MD-TAP, learn more about IT Accessibility Initiative, learn more about Teleaccess Maryland on our own webpage. Ideally, preferably, that would be visible, but it is another method of at least adding the information so that a screen reader user doesn't just get learn more, learn more, learn more. So I hope that was clear, is that yes, ideally this was not the perfect example. It's really, I'm just trying to make sure people understand, use more than a word and use identifiers. You're welcome. I'm sorry that wasn't entirely clear, and I could have done this better, but I will keep that in mind for next time, and I will make that adjustment to help provide that as a more sufficient example. All right, we are at time, so if there are no more questions, I'm going to stop here. It looks like it, so I'm going to stop the recording.